Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics. I'm Bruce Jones. We're kind of concluding our discussion of monetary theory and policy, and we've kind of been building to this point as we've gone through this. We've talked about how money is created within the banking system. We've also talked a little bit about how the Federal Reserve, at least in the United States, is responsible for monetary policy, and that they control the monetary creation system, but more importantly, they buy and sell government securities, which is their primary means for changing the money supply. Now we're to a point where we want to talk a little bit about what we've really been building to here, and that is the whole idea of using monetary policy to accomplish the goals that we have. Again, in our country, in the United States, the Federal Reserve is responsible for that. And as was the case when we talked about the fiscal side of the house, there's some disagreement about exactly how that works. And one of the things that you'll observe if you look at the history of the Federal Reserve is that they have tended to go more in one direction at one point and more in another direction at another point. So they've kind of changed their mind from time to time about which one is the more accurate. So what we're going to see today is there are basically three different approaches to monetary policy. So first up, let's talk a little bit about what monetary policy is, then we'll talk about the three different schools and kind of leave it at that point. Monetary policy is any change in the money supply, the aim being to reach the macroeconomic goals. Now we've talked a couple of times about the three macroeconomic goals, the three things that all societies attempt to accomplish through policy changes, and so it's the same ones we've been talking about before. Essentially, what we're talking about now is the Federal Reserve, or if it's in another country, whoever's responsible for that monetary policy in that country, typically what they'll do is buy or sell government securities in order to increase or decrease the money supply. Our quest today is to figure out why they might want to do that and what they're trying to accomplish by doing so. It turns out there are actually three different models, three different ways of approaching that. The first one is called the classical one, and it's based on a thing called the equation of exchange. Classically, this was denoted as MV equals PQ. We're going to use a slightly different version, and we're going to say M times V is equal to P times GDP real, where M is the size of the money supply, that is the actual physical count of the number of pieces of money. And oh, by the way, it's probably the easiest way to approach this is to think about it in terms of a money system in which we don't have checking accounts, we simply have pieces of paper, because that's the way this was originally intended. That's how it was created to begin with, so it's easier if you think of it in that sense. So you might think of the money supply as a stack of $1 bills or something of that sort. V is the velocity of money. It's the number of times each one of the dollars is used. P is the price level, and the last thing is our old friend GDP real, which is actually the count of goods and services available within the economy. Another way of looking at that is M times V is equal to GDP nominal, and the reason for that, of course, is that GDP nominal is nothing more than the price level times the real GDP. What this leads you to, the conclusion it leads you to come to in the classical model is that there's a direct relationship between the money supply and the price level. And essentially what the classicals do, and I'll show you, if you look at this, if the assumption is that velocity is constant and real GDP is constant, because if you remember back to the fiscal side of the house, when we talked about the fiscal side of the house, the classical theory is that we're always at full employment, real GDP. That is, we're producing the maximum amount we possibly can. We're on the PP frontier. If we're always producing the maximum amount we possibly can and velocity is constant, there's only two things that can change. As M rises, P also will rise. That is, as the money supply gets larger, the price level will have to go up because everything else has been assumed constant. In other words, if velocity is constant and GDP real is constant, and M increases, the only thing that can make that equation still be an equality is the price level. So one of the assumptions in the classical model is that velocity is constant. And so in that case, we actually have a one-for-one change. That is, they're directly connected. So if the money supply rises by 10%, then we would expect to see an increase in GDP, nominal GDP of 10%, but no change in GDP real. That is, we're already producing the maximum amount of goods that we can produce, and so if we increase the amount of money in the economy, all that we're going to do is increase the price level, and it'll be an exact, the two walk in lockstep with one another. Now, there's some disagreement about whether this is actually true or not. That is, whether the velocity of money is actually true or not, and this is a pretty old form of this theory. So along came a new group called the Monetarist. And monetarism is really just a adaptation of the classical theory. It's a kind of a modernization of the classical theory. Another way of looking at it is it's kind of a neoclassical theory. And monetarism holds that velocity is not necessarily constant. That is, it is the case that sometimes people want to be rid of money. They want to spend it as quickly as possible. Good example of that would be in cases where prices are going up fairly fast. Consumers would not want to hold on to dollars. They'd want to spend them as quickly as possible. And so as a result, velocity would go up. So in that case, changes in the money supply or changes in velocity could cause changes in aggregate demand. And you see here that really what's happening is they're relaxing the assumption that we're always at full employment, real GDP. That is, there is some slack within the system to increase the level of output of goods and services. So as a result, it's possible that we might change price level, but it's also possible that we might change real GDP, at least in the short run. So monetarism, in a sense, it allows for a little more dynamics in the system. It allows for the system to adapt or to change based on changing situations, and especially based on changes in terms of how consumers are approaching things. The result is the economy will naturally adjust back to a natural real GDP, and just as is the case with the classical theory, the monetarists believe that in the long run there's not a lot you can do to affect aggregate demand. In the long run, all you can affect is the price level. Keynesian theory, on the other hand, sees this in an entirely different way. And as we saw in the Keynesian model before, it's very focused on the fiscal side. According to the Keynesian theory, the only reason we even care about monetary theory is because it changes the total expenditures in the economy, and if it changes total expenditures, then it changes real GDP. The Keynesian theory depends on an idea which is known as the Keynesian monetary transmission mechanism. That's a great terminology that you can use to impress all of your friends. Essentially what it means is the money supply effectively changes real GDP, but it does it through a series of steps, and thus the whole idea of a mechanism. In other words, in the Keynesian theory, we're making a monetary change, and there is a mechanism for transmitting that to the real side of the household. There is a way of changing real GDP through a series of steps. So let's see if we can see what those steps are. First thing that happens is there's an increase in the money supply. This increase in the money supply has the effect of decreasing interest rates. Decreasing interest rates. Now notice that in the monetarist version or the classical version, there's absolutely no consideration whatsoever for the interest rate. Because if you'll think back to what we were talking about when we talked about the classical theory, if you'll remember, we talked about the loanable funds theory, and we said that there's always an equilibrium in that marketplace, and there's always a certain amount of savings and a certain amount of investment, and that doesn't change because the economy is always at a kind of an equilibrium that it stays at all the time. Well, the Keynesian version of this is that the only real impact of any changes in the money supply is a change in interest rates. Now, going back to what we said on the fiscal side when we were talking about this, remember that that investment was very interest sensitive. So that's the next step in our transmission mechanism. As the interest rate falls, there's an increase in investment. This increase in investment is ultimately an increase in total expenditures. We get more productive capacity. And remember that on the fiscal side, when we get an increase in total expenditures, that gets multiplied through the multiplier effect, and we get an increase in real GDP. So the Keynesian monetary transmission mechanism basically says the only reason we care about the money supply is because it affects interest rates, and interest rates affect investment, which ultimately changes real GDP. Now, it's possible that that might fail. That transmission mechanism might fail for a number of different reasons. One is investment may not be as interest sensitive as the theory would lead you to believe. This especially could be the case if we're in a situation such as a recession when investors are not really interested in investing. If you already have excess plant and equipment, there's not really a whole lot of need to put additional plant and equipment. So no matter what happens to the interest rate in that sort of a situation, it may not lead to additional investment. Second, there's a thing known as the liquidity trap, which means that any increase in the money supply doesn't decrease interest rates. In other words, interest rates are at a minimum, they're in a trap, and so the interest rates don't fall at all. So the two arguments here are, number one, investment may not be as interest sensitive as it would appear, especially when things aren't too good in the economy. And second, it may be that adding additional liquidity, adding additional money supply won't decrease interest rates, that it'll just simply sit in the economy. And we've seen both of these happen in our economy. Not to say that the Keynesian monetary transmission mechanism always fails, but we've seen this happen before. Of course, we've seen cases where it didn't happen. The monetarist transmission mechanism is a little bit more direct. In the monetarist transmission mechanism, an increase in the money supply increases total expenditures directly. That is, people immediately spend that increased money supply, and then that increases real GDP. And the opposite, of course, would also hold. That is, if you decrease the money supply, then total expenditures would go down and real GDP would go down. So the question arises, who's right about this? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on when you're talking about and what the state of the economy is and what the psychology is. Monetary policy can be used to close recessionary gaps or inflationary gaps, has been used to close recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps. It has the advantage of being much more quickly, it's quicker to do it than it would be with fiscal policy. If you remember when we talked about fiscal policy, we said that with fiscal policy you have all of this whole series of lags. You've got to figure out where you are. You've got to figure out what's the proper policy at this point. You've got to propose bills into the Congress. The Congress has to have committee meetings on those. The Congress has to decide whether to go forward with it or not. It has to be passed in both houses and then signed into law, and then it begins to start taking effect. And typically speaking, we're actually spending the money on goods and services, so the multiplier effect takes a period of time. One of the advantages of monetary policy is you can do it immediately, and typically speaking, assuming we don't have a liquidity trap, or alternatively assuming that the monetarist transmission mechanism is more apropos, then it immediately begins to work, and we immediately begin to get the multiplier effect. So there's some clear advantages to monetary policy over fiscal policy. Now, there are some disadvantages too, and that is that if the classical theory is closer to being correct, and it may be at times, then what you're going to get is a lot of price changes, as well as the fiscal effects that you're hoping to have happen as well. The Keynesian theory, proper policy says that we would use fiscal and monetary policy together to move the economy toward the natural real GDP. So that would mean that we'd coordinate those two policies. You could assume that what you'd want to do is begin with monetary policy, since that's quickly implemented, and then add fiscal policy. And most Keynesians believe that the liquidity trap is, if it occurs at all, is a fairly infrequent sort of an occurrence. Monetarists, on the other hand, monetarists often talk about having a set money rule. That is, to simply peg the changes to the changes in real GDP and say we're not going to be too activist on this. We might use monetary policy to a certain extent, but it's only for fine-tuning. It's not the big knob, it's the little knob. It's the knob that we use to fine-tune the economy, but we have to be very careful about destabilizing the economy. And oftentimes they will actually vote for a monetary rule. This is especially the case if the economy seems to be doing okay. That is, if we're not in a recession or in a contraction phase, then they would want to link the money supply growth to the real GDP growth. And the theory there being that the best thing that you could accomplish with monetary theory is just to keep a stable price level. That at moments like that, when we're not in a contraction and we're not in a recession, at moments like that, the only achievable economic goal is simply to stabilize price level. You can't build the economy up. You can't expand the economy that way. This leads us to a discussion of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, many people in years gone by, a lot of people knew a lot about the Great Depression, but that generation is beginning to die out. It began at least somewhere between 1929 and 1933, depending on who you ask. It was the most severe downturn the American economy ever had. Real GDP decreased by 27%, that is over a quarter. Investment spending fell by 82%. There were many, many factories that were closed with machinery and tools inside that were not being used at all. The workers weren't working. There was no product being produced. The CPI, the price index for consumers, fell by 24%. Now, this is a real odd thing for us to think about today, actually having prices fall, but prices were actually falling, fell by 1/4. The reason for this is nobody had any money to buy anything with, and so demand was falling drastically. The unemployment rate went from 3% to about 25%. And I've seen other estimates that go as high as 27%. So, at least a quarter of the workforce was out of work. And that's just an absolute social catastrophe as a result. The Keynesian explanation for that is that everybody got very pessimistic after the stock market crash of 1929. Investment spending stopped. That is, people were not building new plant and equipment, were not making investments in plant and equipment. And so that multiplied, think back to the fiscal policy section, that multiplied in terms of the real GDP. In other words, we started going down, and then the multiplier effect kicked in, and we always talk about the multiplier effect on the uptick, but it works on the downtick as well. The federal government could have stepped in at this point and done something expansionary, either fiscal or monetary-wise, but did neither. As banks were collapsing, there was no Federal Reserve at this time, but as banks were collapsing, no one did anything about it. As real GDP began to fall, nobody did anything about it. And so really what caused the Great Depression to occur was our lack of any strong, overt action to try to stop it from occurring. Classical explanation is a little bit different. And there were in the classical explanation, there were two major government mistakes. The first was the Fed allowed a decrease in the money supply, which caused deflation, and that, of course, killed all investment spending. The other explanation is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was aimed at trying to protect businesses within the United States from outside goods, and the result was there was all of these retaliatory tariffs. In other words, when we told European manufacturers that they couldn't ship their goods in this country, they said the same thing about ours, and the result was that world trade just screeched to a halt. And the Great Depression is not a uniquely United States phenomena. It happened throughout the world. Both of those are probably good explanations, but I'm not sure either one of them are a complete explanation. It's a time period in our life, in the life of this country, that we would prefer never to have happen again. And it's an interesting time period. It's a time period, it's of great interest, of course, to economists, but it also had tremendous social implications and tremendous philosophical implications as well. So if you ever have a chance to talk with someone who lived through the Great Depression, it's worth your while to have that discussion with them and get their take on it. Well, that's what we wanted to talk about today for monetary policy and the use of monetary policy to achieve economic goals, and we'll see you next time.